The idea of dialogic listening is really rooted in how we understand dialogue. And dialogue is thought to be different in terms of conversations than something such as debate or discussion or even deliberation. Debate is associated with a competitive focus on the message that you want to get across and the other person understanding you and accepting your ideas and being persuaded by you. Versus in also both dialogue that we're talking about and then discussion, you're not as much concerned about a competitive focus and winning and persuading the other person as you're more focused on being understood and understanding the other person. But there is a difference between discussion and dialogue, because in discussion there can be power differences in which the other person can feel like if they're in a low power situation that they have to accept what the person in the high power situation says. However, in dialogue, you really eliminate power differences, and the people feel like they can freely express themselves and talk with one another and create new meanings together and focus on the us of the situation rather than the me or the you of the situation. Dialogue creates a space for different kinds of interpretations and multiple meanings and being open to that. And the picture that is used is that of mutually sculpting. That is, if you were to sit down at a potter's wheel and you were to have multiple people working on a creation in front of you that are molding and shaping the clay as it grows and as it forms into something new and different. And if you have multiple people working on that, they are creating something together, right? It's a joint process. And that is the picture of meaning and how it's created in relationships and dialogic listening, because meaning is co-created through multiple artists. You might think of it as a collaborative process, and it's focusing on an our or an us rather than on an other or a me. As you noticed in empathic listening, you're focused on the other person. That is, you're focused on learning about them, studying them, understanding where they're coming from, walking in their shoes, being sensitive to their emotions and their what they're going through. Versus in dialogic listening, it's a focus on the us, on the relationship, how it's unfolding, what you can create together in terms of meaning, and what you can produce together. So within dialogic listening, there are 3 specific skills that your additional reading talks about that can help you to focus on the our, the us. One of them is a paraphrase plus. Secondly, then there is soliciting paraphrasing. And then thirdly, there's the use of metaphors. I really want you to look at the text because there are sample dialogues that help to really better understand what each of these 3 things are and how they can be used in what is described as nexting. That is, seeing what's next for the relationship, for the communication encounter. And how you, through the use of language and nonverbal cues, can create something meaningful with one another and create new and different and multifaceted interpretations of what's going on. Now, I do want to turn our focus to interpreting nonverbal cues because your text spends a lot of time discussing interpreting nonverbal. We're not going to go into the depth that the text does. However, I do want to highlight some of these things. There's an entire class in our Department on Nonverbal Communication, and I would point you toward that class, even though through this course we are discussing some aspects of nonverbal. Ethnocentrism is a problem within interpreting nonverbal cues because we interpret other people's nonverbal cues through our own ways of doing things, through our own culture, through our own experiences, rather than interpreting their nonverbal cues through their culture, through their experiences, through their values. And so with an ethnocentrist focus in our interpretation of nonverbal cues, you can understand why there's a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding. Nonverbal carries upwards of 65% of meaning, yet these cues are often very misunderstood. And if I were to sit here and tell you that I can tell you right now how we can study different cultures and how we can accurately understand everybody's nonverbal cues, I would be lying. And that would be a farce because there are so many different reasons and motivations And also, not every nonverbal cue is an intentional cue in and of itself. There can be unintentionality to it, in which it can communicate something the other person never meant for it to, and it can be very inaccurate. So with that said, though, I do want to really preface this that contexting is the way that we can more accurately interpret nonverbal cues. Because what we do is we context it through the historical, environmental, social, and cultural contexts. And these contexts all are going to give greater meaning to the different cues. You can also better understand different cultures. Now, this is not to say that you can read somebody like a book if you just understand the cultural identity of the person. However, it can give you some indications of certain messages. For example, in high context cultures, context carries a lot of meaning. That means that the nonverbal cues that regulate interaction, that reinforce certain messages, sometimes are primary in terms of the message that they're sending. Just for example, it may be that in a high context culture, where you sit at the table indicates who's the person of honor and who's paying for the meal. I know when I was in China, I was always told, okay, if the other person is paying for the meal, they're going to sit at this point in the table, and if you try to pay for the meal when they're sitting there, that's considered an insult. So you need to really be careful about where you sit. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to really think about this before I sit down. It's not just, what seat do I like? There's a whole lot more to it. And so contexting and understanding the context of the culture. Low context cultures are much more direct in terms of what they're communicating. They would usually, instead of one person getting up to pay for the ticket because of where they're sitting and it being a cultural indication of that, in a low context culture, two people might argue about who's paying, and they're going to be very direct about it. This is what I think, this is why I think I should pay, and so I'm gonna take the check and I'm gonna go pay for it. So you have to consider the cultural context of a message, and you have to think about if someone is from a high context or a low context culture. You might guess that many Asian and Middle Eastern countries are high context, and a lot of European countries, including also the United States, are going to be more low context cultures. Intentionality also has implications for the message and how it's interpreted. And whether you interpret it as unintentional or intentional, it's going to have an impact, all right? But you have to be very careful. Sometimes someone may be fidgeting with something and you think they're bored, or they are really energetic, or they want to interrupt. And really that's just a habit that they have, and they're always playing with their rings, or they're always messing with their necklace, or they're constantly putting their hair behind their ear, and it has really no indication of them being bored or they're being frustrated or whatever. So you do need to be careful when you start to engage intentionality, and know that when you ascribe motives to the other person, lots of times what happens is it shuts down communication rather than opens it up for further conversation. There are a number of different categories of nonverbal behavior. I encourage you to look at those, and the textbook actually gives some indications of warm behaviors versus cold behaviors, which warm behaviors are going to help the other person to open up to you, versus cold behaviors usually result in someone shutting down and not wanting to continue the conversation with you, or at least in the depth that they were. So you want to engage in warm behaviors such as direct eye contact, touching, smiling, nodding, open eyes rather than squinted eyes, appropriate posture, positive facial expressions, but always remember that warm and cold behaviors are culturally specific, and so you really need to understand the cultural identity of the other person. There's an interdependence between your verbal and nonverbal cues, meaning they affect one another, and they can have many different relationships, such as contradicting or substituting or complementing and emphasizing one another. They can be regulatory to the conversation, or they can be repeating of other things that you've said, and they can even exert power. Your different nonverbal and verbal cues can. So you want to monitor your own verbal and nonverbal behavior and understand how, as a listener, that communicates to another person. But you also, in interpreting other people's nonverbal behavior, have to take it with a grain of salt and understand that through your encouraging and your nexting, you can get the other person to open up so that you can more accurately understand where they're coming from. You're not going to be able to gauge that solely from their nonverbal.